So we are in this period of time. Big picture is preparation for the cross, broken up really into 2 6-month periods, one of private preparation, which we concluded already, where Jesus was seeking private time alone with his disciples, the 12 apostles, where he could explain to them that he is going to die and that the kingdom isn't coming now. Truths that were very difficult for them to grasp, and they're still struggling with grasping it. Then we shifted in to this period of mixed focus. So during that time of private preparation, Jesus was trying to be alone and really avoiding crowds, wasn't doing many miracles, and it was in Gentile territory to avoid crowds. Now we're in this period of mixed focus where Jesus does kind of come in and out of doing miracles and teaching, but he's also, again, it's a mixed focus. He's not doing that all of the time. And we are in that period now. We started it last week, spring or September, October of AD 32. And we will, depending on how far we get today, we'll conclude either in March or the February time frame, or even get up into March. So we are going to end today either a few weeks before the Passion Week and the Triumphal Entry, or a few days before the Triumphal Entry, depending on how far we go. So we're going to cover that 6-month period and some of the highlights that happen, and then we'll get into that Passion Week, which will be the final week of Christ's earthly ministry before the resurrection. So last time we looked at this period of mixed focus, and just kind of recapping, again, there's 3 times that Jesus was going to go into Jerusalem. We talked about how Luke's gospel and John's gospel fit together. From Luke 9:51 to 19:27, there is what we look at as Luke's travel narrative, and that is basically a recording of Jesus's travels. It's like he goes to Jerusalem, but Luke doesn't record Jesus getting to Jerusalem. Conversely, John doesn't talk about Jesus getting to Jerusalem, but he talks about the activities of Jesus in or around Jerusalem. And so we'll be looking at those today and how those fit together. We looked at the Feast of Tabernacles, and we started up out of the Feast of Booths, and we will pick that up again. He arrived and just started at the Feast of Tabernacles last time. We talked about his travels through Samaria. We will pick up there today and move forward with the Feast of Tabernacles or Feast of Booths. We'll then go on to the Feast of Dedication, and then the resurrection of Lazarus. Again, this period is characterized by John 7:30. So they were seeking to arrest him, Jesus, and this is the Jewish leaders here, and yet no one laid a hand on him because his hour had not yet come. I mean, if you're doing the reading from the harmonies, you would have seen that phrase several times in the verses for today, because, again, they're seeking to seize him, but his hour hadn't come. But his hour is coming, and it's coming very quickly. And so Jesus is on his way to Jerusalem, and that's ultimately what his goal is, getting to the cross at the right time. We talked about the structure, and again, I won't go through these details again, but we did talk a little bit about the Feast of Booths and just started into this, and this is where we'll pick up today and talk a little bit about Jesus's teaching here. So again, when we left off here before we got into this, Jesus and the 12 were back in his hometown in Capernaum, and he was rebuking them for their concern of who was the greatest, and so they were back in Galilee. His brothers, or his half-brothers, I guess, actually came and were ridiculing Jesus. It was sarcastic. Well, you need to go to Jerusalem for the feast and show yourself if you're, because you're so great and you need to let people know. And Jesus says, nah, you go on. I'm not going to go with you guys. And that turns out Jesus does go. He goes secretly, and he goes through Samaria. And we talked about that last time, where Jesus was going through Samaria. So that was the normal caravan route that people would take as they're going through the Harod Valley. Then they go down the Jordan Rift, and then they cross over by Jericho and then head on into Jerusalem. So that is the route that the caravans go. That's the route Jesus's half-brothers would have went. But Jesus goes through Samaria, and he ends up in Jerusalem. And this is where we stopped last time. We didn't get into Jesus's teaching in Samaria. So we'll pick up here. Now, again, this section, it's real easy. I talk about trying to put the Gospels together and kind of forming a map. So thinking of this time period, if we are in Jerusalem or Bethany nearby, we are in John. If we are not in Jerusalem, we're in Luke, because Luke records the travels, John records the events in Jerusalem. So that is a tool that can help you put these things together. And Matthew and Mark are silent, essentially, on this 6-month period. Okay. We talked about Samaria at the feast. Now let's go ahead and jump in here, looking at our study. So again, after these things, verse 1, chapter 7, picking up where we left off, Jesus was walking in Galilee, for he was unwilling to walk in Judea because the Jews were seeking to kill him. And so again, he will be in Judea soon, and we'll talk about that. But right now, this is kind of his general disposition. Now, he's going down to the Feast of the Booths, and we talked about that. Verse 10, so his brothers had gone up, then he himself also went up, but not publicly, as if in secret. So the Jews were seeking him at the feast and were saying, "Where is he?" There was much grumbling among the crowds concerning him. Some were saying he is a good man. Others were saying, no, on the contrary, he leads the people astray. Yet no one was speaking openly of him for fear of the Jews. So Jesus is the talk of the town. He's not there. The festival is there, and everybody's talking about him. But they're not doing it publicly because they don't want to draw the attention of the Jewish leaders. And again, Jesus is effectively a wanted man at this point. He is a wanted man at this point. And so they don't want the Jewish leaders to know they're talking about him, just kind of downplaying it, but everybody is talking about Jesus. Now, when it was in the midst of the feast, Jesus went up into the temple and he began to teach. So again, Jesus is going to be safe because there are crowds, right? This is still a mechanism that's going to work for Jesus. He can go and be in the crowds, and they can't seize him because that would start a riot. That's the last thing the Jews want to do during Passover because the Romans are all over the place. Again, Rome would bring in more soldiers and be ready to put down any kind of uprising. Because here, the Jews are celebrating their freedom from Egypt when they left and pushed back the Egyptian power on them. And so, again, it was a normal time of tension. So he goes up and he starts teaching. And the Jews then were astonished, saying, "How has this man become learned, having never been educated?" So Jesus is going to talk about his teaching, how his teaching is from God. But it's obvious that Jesus is teaching them like their best rabbi would, because he really effectively is. But he never went to school. He didn't train, with Gamaliel or any of the others. And so how is this? And so he's going to be speaking to him, and he comes up and he knows this. And Jesus says in verse 19, "Did not Moses give you the law, and that yet none of you carries out the law? Why do you seek to kill me?" Now, it's interesting because the crowd is going to say, "You have a demon. Who seeks to kill you?" So they're really being disingenuous here. They're lying. They know who wants to kill him. And you know how we know that? We can be certain because the text tells us down in like verse 25, just a few more verses, the crowd is saying, some of the people of Jerusalem are saying, "Is this not the man whom they are seeking to kill?" So, like, who's trying to kill you? And then they're like, "Isn't this the guy they're trying to kill?" Yeah. So they know. And again, this isn't secret. And another question that's interesting, though, is also here in verse 26. Look, he is speaking publicly, and they, the Jewish leaders, are saying nothing to him. Well, the reason is because they fear the crowds and what could happen. And they've tried this before, and every time they engage Jesus, which they will do again during Passion Week, but Jesus totally humiliates them. He gives them questions they can't answer, or it just shows their self-righteousness and exposes them. So they're not really wanting to engage Jesus publicly because that can just stir the crowds up against them. Make one political comment. It's like, why have a debate when you don't have to? All right. So that's kind of what's going on here. So they don't want to do that. They just want to get Jesus and get him out of there. All right. So the people ask, though, the rulers do not really know that this is the Christ, do they? Now, we've seen this question before back in Matthew 12. Back in Matthew 12, the Greek was very clear where the people expected a negative answer. The answer is no. And it was kind of sarcastic or rhetorical. It's like, this really can't be Jesus, right? It's like, no, of course not. The Greek here doesn't show that. So here, there are people saying they don't know that this is the Christ, and there's no expectation of a negative answer. At this point, they're like, this really could be. And indeed, we're going to see that because they're going to say, well, here, we'll keep reading. Verse 31, "But many of the crowd believed in him, and they were saying, when the Christ comes, he will not perform more signs than those which this man has, will he? Should the Christ do more than this?" Which says a lot for what Christ is doing. So there are people who are believing in Jesus here at this feast. And so when they ask the question, they're like, hey, how come the rulers aren't doing anything? Do they know? I mean, lots of people here, not lots, but there's a number of people who, many it says, are believing in him. Now, look again at verse 30. I highlighted it. "So they were seeking to seize him, and no man laid hands on him because his hour had not yet come." Again, we're going to see this over and over and over again. Now, the Pharisees do hear the crowd muttering these things, and the chief priests and the Pharisees sent officers to seize him. So they're going to send their, associates out to capture Jesus. It's like, okay, we got to get him out. And so they're going to arrest him and capture him and lay hands on him. And Jesus starts talking about leaving and going to a place where they can't find him. And that kind of confuses people. But the point here is they don't seize him. And so they're either going to go back to the Pharisees that sent them out and say, well, where's Jesus? And he goes, man, you should have heard what he said. And they're like, well, you're not becoming his disciples too, are you? And so, yeah. All right, so let's talk a little bit about this here, because there's one thing here that's interesting. And I didn't go into detail about this last time. And that is about the Feast of Tabernacles. So with the Feast of Tabernacles, It's a 7-day feast that begins on the 15th day of Tishri, which usually occurs in October. And it's the 7th and final biblical feast of the year outlined in the Torah. Did I say this before? I don't think I did. Okay. There are 4 in the spring and 3 in the fall. Jews erect little huts or booths as a reminder of the temporary housing erected by their forefathers during the Exodus wanderings. They take samples of the fall crop, and they're hung in each family's booth to acknowledge God's faithfulness in providing for his people. Okay? Now, here's the point I want to talk about. Each day of the feast, among other festivities, the high priest would lead a processional of priests and tens of thousands of people from the Temple Mount down to the Pool of Siloam. And I wish I had a picture up here of Jerusalem, but I'm not going to pull it down now. There, the priest would fill a pitcher of water and then lead the processional back to the temple, where with great ceremony, the pitcher of water was poured out on the altar. So think about this. They're in the temple. The high priest, he grabs his pitcher. He walks out of the temple. He goes down into the city of David to the Pool of Siloam. He fills up the pitcher and he goes up. And this is like a big parade, like this, like Macy's Day Parade, right? And they do this, tens of thousands of people, and he pours it on the altar. Why? It's symbolizing, this is kind of like, I don't want to get weird, but it's kind of like asking God for rain. We're getting into the rain season, and then the water comes and, it makes the crops grow because we're in the spring, right? And we need the rains to come. And so basically, this is the water that gives life. And so on the last day is the big day. So the priest would fill that pitcher of water, great ceremony, the pitcher is poured out. Now in Israel, the rains normally stop in March, and there's no rain for almost 7 months. Now, if God does not provide the early rains in October and November, there will be no spring crop, because you got to remember their seasons are different than ours, right? And the famine is likely. And again, so we're in this September, October time frame for this feast here. So the ceremony then is also intended to invoke God's blessing on the nation so that he might provide life-giving water. Okay? And so he does this, and this is a symbol of we're asking God to bring water because we need the rain so that we can live. Because without water, without the rain, we have no food. Okay? Now let's look what Jesus says. Verse 37. On the last day, the great day of the feast, the big one. This is like everything else was kind of leading up to this one. Jesus stood and cried out, saying, "If anyone is thirsty, let him come to me and drink. He who believes in me, as the scripture said, from his innermost being will flow rivers of living water." And so, again, it's a picture where Jesus uses the same illustration with the woman at the well. And so now he's saying, this is why Jesus is saying it at this feast. It's symbolic of the fact that he gives life. Yeah, we need the rain, we need the crops, but Jesus is the one who gives life. And so he's saying, look at me. And so he's tying into the symbolism of the feast and showing how it relates to him personally as well. Any questions on that? I got confusing. Okay. All right. But thus he spoke of the Spirit, whom those who believed in him were to receive, for the Spirit was not yet given because Jesus was not yet glorified. So there we're talking about the new covenant ministry of the Holy Spirit that'll happen after Jesus' ascension on the day of Pentecost. All right. So people are talking about these things. They are divided. And this certainly is the prophet. Others are saying this is the Christ. Others are saying surely Christ is not going to come from Galilee, is he? So they still have this problem. And the officers, like I said, verse 45, came to the chief priests, and they said to him, "Why did you not bring him?" And they said, "Never has a man spoken the way this man has." The Pharisees then answered, You have not been led astray, have you? Not one of the rulers or Pharisees has believed in him, has he? So we don't believe in him. Why do you? But this crowd, which does not know the law, is accursed. Now, Nicodemus, who actually is going to be a believer somewhere along the way here, is he's like, hey, look, we got to follow the law. We can't just go seize this guy and kill him. And we got to let him have a trial. And Nicodemus wasn't the most popular guy in the Sanhedrin. All right, so let's move on. Because Jesus is teaching at the feast. And he's going to have several teachings. Woman caught in adultery, Jesus is the light of the world, the truth will make you free, healing of the man born blind, and Jesus is the good shepherd. There's only I want to touch on one of these, and then another thing that Jesus does. And the one that I want to talk about really is the woman caught in adultery. Go back to my picture here. All right. So in your New Testament, there are two, I guess I should say, significant textual critical issues. Doesn't affect doctrine, doesn't affect anything about our faith. But in terms of the manuscript, is this a reliable text that we have? The two of them where we just don't know, well, I'm pretty certain on part of it, is the ending of Mark. So when it comes to Mark, there are actually 5 different endings to the Gospel of Mark. There's the abrupt ending, which we call the short ending, which ends at 16:8. There's the longer ending, which goes like to the end of what we have in our Bibles. It's all in brackets. Our focus is on John, so we're not going to spend too much time in Mark. And then there's a shorter ending, which isn't the shortest. The shortest is 16:8, right before the bracket. All texts have that. We're all agreed on that. The question is, how come there's some manuscripts that have more verses? And we'll look at that here in a little bit. So then there is this passage in John, the pericope on the woman caught in adultery. And you will note in your Bibles that it is bracketed from chapter 7, verse 53 to chapter 8, verse 11. And the reason why that is in brackets is because in our most reliable manuscripts, those verses are not there. I'm going to show you an example of that in a minute. But it also shows up in a number of different places, which means, and what I mean by that is sometimes it's right here in John, but other places it's in different places in John. I think there's one case where it actually shows up in Luke. So this account is included in different places. And so how could that be, right? Most manuscripts that include it have it here, where we have it in our Bibles, between John 7 and 8. Others have it, at the end of John, and still others have it in a couple different places in Luke. However, this is where it's interesting thing about passages like this, and this is why I'm talking about it. Even though it's most likely not inspired, okay, because it's not in our, some of the earliest evidence that we have. So we don't have, it could be, but the odds are against it based on the textual history that we have, that John, under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, didn't write this down in his original forming of his gospel. But that doesn't mean it's not true. It's most likely, and I think in this case, it most likely a true record of an actual event that did occur. And so that's kind of where I'm at with this. I think this is true. I think Jesus really did this. And I think the way it's formed and put together is that this is a historical record, not an inspired record, but it's a historical record. I believe that is not as trustworthy as the rest of the Gospel of John, which is inspired and inerrant, infallible in the original text. So let's talk a little bit about it. So moving on, got a couple things here I want to show you. These are pictures from Codex Vaticanus. Now, as I said, there's a number of Greek manuscripts that do not include verses 753 to 811. These include P66, P75, Aleph, which we know as Sinaiticus, and B, which is Vaticanus. All Alexandrinus doesn't have it, and also Ephraem Receptus. So some of the major manuscripts do not have this. And so our best witnesses to the text of the New Testament in its earliest form don't include it. So we can see that here. So this is going to be the end of John 7. So from the Galilee prophets, no prophet arises, all right? So that's going to be 752. Then we're going to have the beginning of verse 8:12, which is, therefore again, he said to them, or he spoke to them saying, okay, so that's 8:12. So those verses aren't there. We have it, and you go to the other major manuscripts. And again, this is the 4th century, so this is the 300s, right? The thing about Vaticanus, it's actually, if I had to just pick one manuscript, this is the one I would go with. We have an eclectic where we go and put everything together, but if we're going to go what they call a diplomatic approach, I would use Vaticanus. It's in the Vatican Library. We have no idea how it got there, but it's been there, known to be there since the 1400s. It's one of the most, if not the most important Greek witnesses to the Greek text, to the New Testament. It's considered to be the oldest extant copy of the Bible. And again, we don't have these verses. Now, what's interesting, so this is the passage we're looking at, but here's the end of the book. This is the end of John. And there's a couple of dots here. It's called an amulet, or umlaut, umlaut, and also known as a dystigmy, symbol made up of 2 dots. It's in the margin here. And what this means is it's been shown to indicate that there was knowledge that a textual variant exists. Question is, okay, so we have something in the manuscript that says that when the person was working on Vaticanus, they put recognition that, hey, there's a variant that's not included. The question is, was that original? So when the scribe made Vaticanus and wrote it down, and copying it, it's a copy, right, of something earlier, did that scribe put these dots there? Or, which means then that's very early, or did someone come by later and add them? It's been shown that generally when we see these kinds of marks, they were original. And if that's the case, then that means that this pericope, this account, is very early. So we have manuscripts that include it that are later, but this might be an indication that while it wasn't included, it was known about very early in the church. So again, I think that's the case, and I think that it's a historical account. Now, one thing about this, and this is something that's technology has enabled, which I think is a very good thing. We call it the kind of the democratization of information about the Bible. Almost all the important manuscripts, and I've got, are available online. Let's just say it. And actually, there's a lot more manuscripts that aren't like the most significant. They're online too. That's what you see, the NTVMR, New Testament Virtual Manuscript Room, on my toolbar. Okay, I have access to that, for like scholar work to look at all kinds of manuscripts, right? Fragments, picture, all that. But Vaticanus, anybody can look at it. You don't need any special access. You just type in Vaticanus online, and it'll take you here. And I'm just showing you here because, well, I know you can't read this, and most of you can. Maybe someone can, but so my apologies if you know how to do that. But you can see right here. This is a picture. If you were to go to the Vatican, into the library, and had access to it, I won't let just anybody do that. But if you did, you could go and look at that page yourself, and you would see it looks just like the picture. And so you don't have to just take my word for it. That's kind of what I'm getting at. When you're reading a commentary and they say something, you don't have to believe it. You can go check yourself. You can go on. Now, you might have to, if you want to really do it, spend time learning how to read this stuff and what all the marks mean. But the point is, this is evidence. This is factual record that you can go and examine yourself. It's not just somebody said. Okay. All right. Any questions about that? All right. Well, you look like you have a question.
I was thinking, that's
Okay.
all. I looked at where and I'm thinking,
Okay. No worries.
happens now and then.
Donna.
This section shows up that's been added because it's when I was reading through it, it's clearly kind of just put in there. It doesn't fit with the flow of the story. You can
Yeah,
finish up with that.
I had that.
Then you could easily skip that and start right back in 8. So it's kind of like stuck in there. I get that. But is there, like, do they have any?
Yeah, no, yeah, I do have that. Let me see if I did. I don't know if I put my notes in here. I didn't put it in my notes of when the first manuscripts that show it occur. I think it's 5th or 6th century. It may be a little later. But I think it's 5th or 6th.
But it never shows up in this document.
Oh, no, not at all. No. Nowhere. Yeah, right.
I just keep thinking about the part where Jesus kneels down and he's writing something in the dirt.
Right.
And
Yeah.
I'm trying to think, how that fits. Because, if you were going to fabricate something, you probably would give a complete story. You wouldn't leave something as a mystery. Maybe, maybe not. I don't know. It just seems kind of funny. It makes it seem more authentic to me, I guess, or more immediate.
Yeah, I think that's you wouldn't need that. That's a detail that wasn't necessary if it was
Yeah.
fiction, right?
Yeah.
Right.
They can't. It doesn't look like they can find out like, who was the eyewitness to this that wrote this, right? Because someone had to witness.
Right, yeah, and the disciples could have been there. I mean, John could have been there, and John could have wrote it later, right? I mean, and not included in his gospel. I mean, there's all kinds of things that could explain where the origin came. We're speculating, right?
Right.
Um,
No evidence in there where it says who saw who's the author of it.
right,
So,
Pam.
yeah, gotcha.
I think the thing that we have to keep remembering though is when they stated that if they had tried to write down everything that happened with
Mhm.
Jesus, they would have not had enough books in the world. And
Right,
we sometimes think that what we're reading, that's all that there was.
right,
We have to remember there's a lot more.
great. Well, and that's actually what this verse says right here. This is the end of the last verse of John, and that's exactly what it says. It's like the world, not containing the world, the books that would have been written. So, yeah. Okay. So on this, we can go into that a little bit. That's really kind of the point here I wanted to talk about with the woman caught in adultery. We won't go into all the teaching because our focus is primarily on the chronology and the events, because you'll hear sermons on this for the rest of your lives. Okay. Man born blind. That's another thing we want to talk about. So we get to John. We'll start looking at John 9. So he's teaching various things. Now we have this episode of the man born blind. So as he passes by, so um, one detail here. Yeah, I say it on my slide. Let me go back to my next slide. Oh, that's not the slide. We're looking at the man born blind, and there's one thing to remember is that the Jews have already decided that anyone who confesses Jesus is the Christ is to be put out of the synagogue. Okay? And we don't really understand what that means. And sometimes it really can impact even our thinking about church discipline that we do in the church today. Um, because to be part of the synagogue was really like the community, particularly in small towns like Nazareth and Bethany and things like that. There wasn't a lot of synagogues in the town. It was the cultural center of their life. Now in Jerusalem, there's going to be the temple and lots of synagogues, but when you're put out of the synagogue, you're basically being excommunicated from the whole town because we say like in church discipline, well, be to that person like anathema, right? Um, well, that's fine, but if you couldn't go to the grocery store and buy groceries, the farmer's market, and get that's a bigger deal, right? And so um, that's one of the things we lose the context here is it's not just being put out of the synagogue, right? Where okay, they just go find another one. This is, or they stop going. No, you're a Jew, and the whole life centers around this. And so now you're kind of put out of the whole town. That's kind of the point. And so that's kind of context for the account here. So Jesus is going to heal this man, but interestingly, the disciples asked him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? And this kind of shows the sovereignty of God. It was neither that this man sinned or his parents, but it was so that the works of God might be displayed in him. So people are born blind, independent of sin, other than the curse that we're all under. But here it was like this guy was born blind so that God could be glorified when I heal him here in a little bit. And so, we must work the works of him who sent me as long as it's day. Light is coming when no one can work. I'm in the world. I'm the light of the world. And so Jesus spits on the ground, makes clay, puts it on his eyes, says, go wash in the pool of Siloam. And so he does. And he went and he washed and he came back seeing. So interestingly, this man is blind. He never saw Jesus. He heard his voice. And so he goes and he obeys. So Jesus gave him something to do, which gave him the opportunity to express his faith. This man just said, if I go wash my eyes, I came to him, and then, or Jesus did this, and it's like, okay, I have faith, I'm going to believe, I'm going to do what he says, and he could see. And everybody knew that this man had been born blind. They saw him as a beggar, and they recognized him, though some weren't quite sure, maybe it's just someone who looks like him. But no, he's definitely the one. And so he goes, and now people are hearing it. And so they were saying to him, how then were your eyes opened? And he answered, the man who was called Jesus made clay, anointed my eyes, and he said to me, go to Siloam and wash. So I went away and washed, and I received sight. They said to him, where is he? And he said, I don't know. So then they go to the Pharisees and this man who was blind and tell them, now here's the problem. It was on the Sabbath, right? And so Jesus did this on the Sabbath. And so the Pharisees are asking him again how he received a sight. And he tells them. And therefore, some of the Pharisees were saying, this man is not from God because he does not keep the Sabbath. And others were saying, how can a man who is a sinner perform such signs? Great question. Great question. And so there was a division. Some are saying, oh, he did it on the Sabbath. That's bad. And he's like, he just healed a blind man. What are you talking about? And so what did you say? They asked him, since he opened your eyes, yeah, he's a prophet, right? He's got to be a prophet. The Jews did not believe it of him that he'd been born blind and received his sight. So they called his parents. Let's bring mom and dad in. Is this your son? Yes. Was he born blind? Yes. Okay, so now they got a problem. How did he receive his sight? They don't know. It says, his parents answered, we know that this is our son, that he was born blind. But how he now sees, we don't know. We have no idea who opened his eyes. They say, ask him, he is of age, he will speak for himself. Now, they may have known, but they may be political here. They might be, why do we want to get thrown out of the synagogue? You know what? We can just say, hey, he's of age, ask him. And so that's what they do. And it tells us, they said this, let him speak for himself, because they were afraid of the Jews, for the Jews had already agreed that if anyone confessed him to be the Christ, he was to be put out of the synagogue. For this reason, his parents said, he is of age, ask him. Again, details that add to validity, right? So they called the man a second time. Like, I already told you. And, it's kind of interesting. He goes, I told you already, verse 27, and you did not listen. Why do you want to hear it again? You do not want to become his disciples too, do you? I love that. Like, you want to hear it again? You want to hear this message? You want to believe in him? And they reviled him and said, you are his disciple, but we are disciples of Moses. We know that God has spoken to Moses, but as for this man, we do not know where he's from. And I love this response. The man answered and said to them, well, here's an amazing thing. That you do not know where he is from, and yet he opened my eyes. You say, no one has ever done this, and you admit that no one has ever done this. He says he's from God, and he gives my sight, and you say, where he's from. So I thought that just tremendous rebuke, and it's perfectly placed. And since the beginning of time, it has never been heard that anyone opened the eyes of a person born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing. And they answered him, you were born entirely in sins, and you are teaching us. So they put him out. He's like, look, it's never happened from the beginning of time. And so it's only because he's from God. And so now he's pushed out of the synagogue. Mom and dad, I guess, can go to the market and buy food for him. But he's got a sight, so that's kind of a good trade-off.
Yeah.
All right, let's see. Now, let's move on to outside of Jerusalem. So remember, during this 6th month, Jesus makes 3 trips. They're recorded. And let me see. Did I get off? No? Okay. Now, we know that so only recorded in John. John equals Jerusalem. Luke's not in Jerusalem. After the feast, he leaves Jerusalem but remains in Judea. Okay, so now we're going to go to Luke 10 and 13. And we know that he's in Judea because of his frequent encounters with the Jewish leaders and his visit with Mary and Martha in Bethany in Luke 10. He's going to saturate this area with his message by sending out 70 disciples in pairs ahead of them. So it's going to be very similar to when he sent out the 12, in twos, when they went through Galilee. But before, in Galilee, he sent them out and Jesus stayed back. Here, he sends them out and Jesus is going ahead of where Jesus is going. So this is kind of like the advance team. They're going to show up. They're going to tell everybody the message. They're going to be doing the things that they did that Jesus commissioned them to do. And then, so everybody is kind of primed for Jesus to come. And then Jesus is going to come and basically be the grand finale in that city and then move on to the next one. healing, teaching, doing all that stuff. And Judea is not as big as Galilee. So we have 35 pairs going throughout this area where Jesus is going to come. He's totally saturating Judea with the message of who he is. And again, this is kind of the priming the pump for the crucifixion. The Jews now are they've been totally guilty before, but now there's no excuse. They've just marketed, that's kind of a modern terminology here, they've broadcast the message, let's use that better, broadcast the message to the whole Judea. Everybody knows, or you'd kind of have to be, head in the sand to not be aware. And Jesus is going through and doing that. Now, he's coming to the villages and towns himself. And during this time, it's about 3 months, Jesus is teaching openly and has frequent encounters with Jewish leaders. So let's go ahead and look at some of this real quick. Luke chapter 10. So, now after this, the Lord appointed 70 others and sent them in pairs ahead of him to every city and place where he himself was going to come. And he was saying to him, the harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. Therefore beseech the Lord of the harvest to send out laborers into the harvest. Go, I send you out as lambs in the midst of wolves. And he's going to give them all these instructions of what to do, and they're going to go out and do it. And then we're going to get more teaching sections here, because remember, in Luke, we're in this travel narrative. Up to this point, he really hasn't included a lot of Jesus's teachings and sayings. But in this section, in this travel log, he captures a lot of the material that's in Matthew and Mark and other places, or in John too, but primarily Matthew and Mark. And he brings it all together in kind of this one section of his gospel. And so it's not as chronological, but it's just capturing things that Jesus said. And Jesus definitely was teaching while he was traveling. So again, Jesus had an itinerant ministry. It isn't just like he said it at the Sermon on the Mount and never said it again. He said it, what he said on the Sermon on the Mount, he said it over and over again, like a stump speech. So, okay. At that very time, okay, so we're going to go, let's see. One of the things that he talks about here in verse 25 of Luke chapter 10, again, he's teaching and such. And turning to the disciples, verse 23, he said, privately, blessed are the eyes which see the things you see. For I say to you, many prophets and kings wish to see the things which you see and did not see them, and to hear the things which you hear and did not hear them. Now, verse 25, I'm going to share with you a speculation. This is, not an uncommon speculation. We don't know, but it's fun to speculate. A lawyer stood up and put him to the test, saying, Teacher, what shall I do to inherit eternal life? And there's some thinking here that this lawyer was actually the Apostle Paul. He's part of the Sanhedrin, right? So the lawyer that gets up and asks questions to Jesus may have been, we don't know, but there's common, I forget the reasoning behind it, but there's a couple places, I think it's this one, where it talks about a lawyer got up and asked him questions, and people think that it might have been Paul. All right, Good Samaritan. Okay, now they're traveling along, and they come to a village of Bethany, here 38. A woman named Martha welcomed him into her home, and she had a sister called Mary, who was seated at the Lord's feet, listening to his word. But Martha was distracted with all of her preparations, and she came to him and said, Lord, do you not care that my sister has left me to do all the serving alone? Yeah, let's go tell Jesus. Then tell her to help me. But the Lord answered and said to her, Martha, Martha, you are worried and bothered by so many things, but only one thing is necessary, for Mary has chosen the good part, which shall not be taken away from her. So Jesus kindly says no. All right. So let's move on to material for today. Well, it's all kind of blending together as we try to move things along. And I apologize. I know we have to speed things up here because we have a couple weeks that fell off the schedule for us. All right. We got to try to make that up. The Feast of Dedication is next. And so we'll come into Luke 13, 22, and then we'll get into John 10. You see all this red. This is Jesus just teaching in the travel narrative. So 13, he's teaching now 22. And he was passing through from one city and village to another, teaching and proceeding on his way to Jerusalem. Again, Luke always shows Jesus getting to Jerusalem, getting to Jerusalem. Luke doesn't show Jesus getting to Jerusalem. And so we go to John, and John's going to talk to us about Jesus getting to Jerusalem. And here we have the Feast of Dedication, which we know as Hanukkah. And so the Feast of Dedication is the second trip to Jerusalem or its immediate surrounding area during this 6-month period. The first trip occurred in mid to late September, which we just talked about, the Feast of Tabernacles or Feast of Booths, after which Jesus spent the intervening 3 months ministering in Judea. You know, they sent the people out, and he's doing all kinds of teaching, going from village and towns along the way. Now, it should be noted that Judea, like I said, is much smaller than Galilee, so this totally immersed the area with this teaching. But now we're in the last half of December. You know, Hanukkah happens around Christmas time. And so we are getting to really the last 3 months or so of Jesus' life. Remember, the Feast of Dedication is not a biblical or Levitical feast, but one that came about during the 400 silent years during the Maccabean revolt. In 164 BC, the Maccabees successfully retook Jerusalem and subsequently cleansed the temple after being defiled by Antiochus Epiphanes. So there's a little harmonization note here. We look at 13:22 in Luke, which I showed you. And then verse 23, and someone said to him, Lord, are there just a few being saved? And really between there, we should put we should put John 10:22 to 44, because that really chronologically is the only way that this really kind of harmonizes and makes the most sense. And so we will be in John 10. And at that time, the Feast of Dedication took place. So Luke says Jesus was proceeding to Jerusalem. Now John tells us what happens in Jerusalem. It was winter, and Jesus was walking in the temple in the portico of Solomon. That sets the time and the place for us. He's walking in the temple. And the Jews gathered around him and were saying, how long will you keep us in suspense? If you are the Christ, tell us plainly. Now, remember the context overall, geopolitically. You've heard me say it so many times, you probably get sick of it. The Jews didn't care if Jesus was a king. They cared if Jesus was a god. They wanted a king. Rome didn't care if Jesus was a god. They cared if he was a king. So this isn't like, tell us that you're really the Christ and we'll believe in you. No, Jesus has done way more than enough to show everybody that he's the Christ. We saw the last feast, people were saying, the Christ couldn't do more than this, could he? So that's not what they're doing. They're trying to get Jesus to say, I'm a king. So then Rome will come. Because remember, the Jewish leaders can't go in and grab Jesus because it'll start a riot. Now, they tried to arrest him, and it didn't work out. That was good. But even if it did, if they were going to arrest him, the crowds are going to go crazy. And so they need Rome to do it. And that's what they want Jesus to do. Tell us that you're the Christ, the Messiah King. so that Rome will come and cut you off for us. And we will stop right there. Pick it up next time.